invited to share my thoughts on this event, the initial idea was for me to say something about Eritrea, which is my country of origin. And then I said, instead of talking narrowly about a single state, why don't try to make it a bit broader in the context of Horn of Africa, and then from there, maybe I can pay some more attention to Eritrea as a specific country, and then try to discuss the challenge of peace and security in the Horn of Africa. So that's what I will be trying to do this afternoon with the topic of my presentation as the Horn of Africa between endless wars and compassion fatigue. So perhaps it's the latter term or phrase, compassion fatigue, which somehow tries to create a link with the concept of forgotten wars, in a sense that not that these wars are completely forgotten from history, they are still happening as we speak now, but it seems to be the other side of the world. It seems to be not so much interested in what's happening on the other side of the world. What are my objectives? I'm trying to address contemporary challenges of peace and security in the Horn of Africa, and in so doing, I will try to address the issue through the perspective of three interrelated theoretical constructs of human development, human security, and human rights. Well, my background is, I come from a legal background. I studied law, but sometimes it's difficult to address or to speak about peace and war from a very narrow perspective of law, or international law for that matter. So it's one attempt of trying to address the problem perhaps from interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary perspective by trying to use other theoretical frameworks. So my main area is human rights, as I said before, but what do we do? What do we get from other related disciplines like human development and human security, or concepts, if not necessarily independent academic disciplines? Then I will try to suggest some practical recommendations aimed at fostering lasting peace and security in the Horn of Africa, in a sense that it's not only theoretical exercise, but what's happening at the ground level is also important. Just basic information about the region. Well, of course, many of you know this, I assume. The region consists, at least in its traditional context, it consists of the following countries: Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the newly independent South Sudan and Sudan. Most people may agree on the following assumptions: that the Horn of Africa has remained for many years or decades as the unremitting bedrock of armed conflicts, which also means a region acutely deprived of non-military solutions to its underlying problems. In fact, David Sheen, for example, one of the leading experts on the region, he says this region of the world is the most conflicted region in the world since the end of the Second World War. There might be many other places in the world which have seen war and armed conflict every now and then, even with much more numbers of casualties, deaths and wounded, destruction, and etc. But in terms of the frequency of conflicts, the Horn of Africa remains a hotspot. This region, none of in its modern history has seen a time where no incident of armed conflict was taking place, at least in one of the countries of the region. As we speak now, right now, there is armed conflict in South Sudan. There is in and off instances of armed conflict in Somalia, so to speak. And in Sudan, we are also witnessing a new upsurge of violence in the old Darfur region of the region, which at some point was described as a situation of genocide. So, by focusing on the incidence of continuity of wars, I will also try to discuss some development and security indicators of the region, as I said before, in terms of the three interrelated concepts. And by discussing Eritrea as a particular case study, I will try to conclude by emphasizing on some important concluding remarks. If we look at the history of the endless wars of this region, we have, for example, at least from the 1950s, the biggest war of the region was the War of Independence waged by Eritrea, my country of origin, against Ethiopia. If we look into other regions, we have the history of long-time civil wars of Sudan since the 1950s, including the genocide of 2003 and 2004. Then, of course, the perennial civil wars in the failed state of Somalia. Perhaps another major conflict was the 1998-2000 border conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. In spite of its formal resolution in 2002, there is still a pervasive stalemate between the two countries. So effectively, there is no peace between the two countries now. That's why some people like Martin Plaut say this region has a habit of taking all observers by surprise. When you think that wars have been ended peacefully or resolved on the table, then you see again another form of armed conflict taking place in one of the regions, in one of the countries in the region. That's why it has produced a surplus of academic literature. If you go to peace and conflict studies, international law, international relations, development studies, and etc., you will find a surplus of academic literature on the Horn of Africa. But perhaps the other side effect, the very negative side effect, is that it has also resulted a certain degree of or sense of compassion fatigue on the side of the international community. I use this phrase, I borrow this phrase from Ramesh Thakur, who is a professor of international relations of an Indian origin. In the context of global challenges and threats, he says, we will get so used to unspeakable statistics that they will cease to shock humanity any longer. So we will have to look for unusually shocking instances to get our attention attracted to what's happening at the ground. So I believe that's again, to come back to the initial remark I made before, it's in this context that I feel the conflicts of the region have been forgotten from the agenda of the remaining part of the international community. It's important to look into some development indicators in a sense that it's not easy to just look into the issues from a very narrow perspective of human rights. If we look to the Human Development Index of UNDP, which is one of the most widely cited reports, the regions of the countries of the region have overall very low indicators. All countries of the Horn of Africa, their Human Development Index is below the regional average of sub-Sahara countries. It's also below the average of other least developed countries in the entire world. You can see the figures of Djibouti, for example, with 0.445 compared to the average, regional average for sub-Saharan Africa, which is 0.475. And the other pictures also do not show promising statistics, with the lowest in the region being that of Eritrea with 0.351. Another indicator I use in my analysis is the Failed States Index, which is prepared by the Fund for Peace. The countries of the Horn of Africa, they make part of the 25 most fragile states in the world. And of course, Somalia is always the epitome of the failed state. I admit that there are controversies on the very definition of a failed state. What's the definition of failed state? But at least there are some kind of commonly agreed characteristics which define a country which is fragile or becoming a failed state. So the situation is described as a condition when a government cannot or will not deliver the core functions to its people, such as security. Just security being one of the core functions, but there are many other elements. When a government cannot provide these services to its population, we can say that the country is leading towards state collapse. And the longer this deficiency persists, then the higher the dangers of becoming a failed state are. Just going back to the previous slide, I would like to indicate that all countries in the region are in the warning or the alert level of the failed state index, of course with varying degrees of state fragility. Now, just to clarify the interrelationship between the three concepts, development, security, and human rights, why are they relevant for our discussion, and what do they mean? What do we mean by development or human security and human rights as concepts? In my approach, I believe the very definition of human security also explains human development and human rights, because in that definition we have a very clear link between the three elements. Experts, or at least the Human Security Report of 2003, defines the concept of human security as a concept which is interested on the protection of the vital core of all human lives in ways that enhance human freedoms and human fulfillment. So in this definition we have human freedoms as representative of human security, human rights, and human fulfillment as representative of the concept of human development. Of course, in its broader context, human development is also concerned with the well-being of the individual in terms of, or in the context of, sustainable economic growth. And again, in very broad terms, what do we mean by human rights? It means fundamental rights, freedoms, and entitlements belonging to all human beings. Now, going back again to the very definition of human security, we will see the link in the two important phrases or terms captured within that definition of the term. The importance of human security can also be understood by expanding the discourse a bit and to get some more insights from the works of Amartya Sen and other scholars who have explored the idea of human development in a very thorough academic exercise. So human security can also be understood in that context. As opposite to traditional conceptions of national security, human security focuses more on the individual, not the state. So it's concerned with the security of the human person. And at this point, I try to elaborate the concept by borrowing some of the theoretical formulations of Amartya Sen in the context of human freedom or development as freedom, which underlines the identification of individual freedom as the main objective of development. So the core objective of human development is identification of individual freedom. And by implication, this means the promotion of human security or individual security, and at the same time the promotion of human rights or individual rights. So manifested in this context, we have the 5 distinct types of freedoms which are elaborated by sense development as freedom. And these are political freedoms, economic facilities, social opportunities, transparency guarantees, and protective security. Now, this has now obtained, of course, global recognition in several other reports, which are globally recognized as consensus documents, or at least as main reference points. I mentioned it before, the UNDP's annual report on human development, or the Human Development Index. We also have the report of the International Commission on Human Security, and at the same time, the report of the UN Secretary General, known as in brief as Enlarged Freedom. All these international consensus documents or reference points have taken the concept of human security to a level where we can say it's becoming, well, it may not have reached a level of international norm, guiding international norm, but we can definitely say that it's becoming a very core, important element of international discourse on security, development, and rights. Now, I mentioned before, human rights as a concept alone is a bit narrower, but also in the context of developing countries, it's also very controversial, because there are always these accusations of cultural relativism. A number of developing countries portraying the concept of human rights as an ideal coming from the Western world, inspired by Western values and incentives or inclinations, and etc., and etc. I believe the interrelationship, trying to relate human rights, trying to create interrelationship between development and human security, somehow diffuses the perception that we see from the rest of the world in the very concept of human rights. So the relevance of this to the Horn of Africa is better understood in terms of the critical challenges we see in the region. Well, one assumption is that governments are crucial, and I agree, most of you will agree with me in this. Governments are crucial to the enabling environment for the elimination of the major cause of vulnerability. If there is no sustainable political environment in any given country, all the objectives of human development, human security, or human rights cannot be improved or cannot be achieved. So in that sense, a region which has been consistently challenged by armed conflict and the calamities that result from armed conflict, human rights violations, and other problems, all the other objectives identified by the three interrelated concepts cannot be easily achieved. So conflict in the region has been taken in recent years. For example, as I mentioned it before, the South Sudan conflict, which started in December 2013, which is still happening as we speak now, in spite of a peace agreement that was signed before about a week or 10 days. And few days after that, the parties who have signed the ceasefire agreement were accusing each other for violating the very peace agreement or the ceasefire agreement that was signed just 2 days before the incident. By the same token, the conflict in Darfur, Sudan, is also taking a new upsurge of violence, as has been seen since February 2004. So the prevailing political situation in most of these countries in this region is antithesis to the overarching objectives of development, security, and human rights. I've been given already of the remaining time, which is not more than 5 minutes. So I'll try, maybe I'll have to to skip some of my slides and try to finish in the next few minutes. Why do we focus on Eritrea as a major problem from the entire Horn of Africa? I think if we look into the history of armed conflicts in this region, Eritrea unfortunately takes, or all countries take their own blame, but Eritrea seems to be playing exceedingly destabilizing role in the entire region for a number of reasons. But from the several factors, I would like to emphasize on the fact that the government in Eritrea has been actually supporting a number of armed groups in the region, in Somalia, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, at least to mention some of the few examples. Internally, the country also has one of the worst record of human rights violations in the entire region, but even as compared with other countries in Africa, with the United Nations Human Rights Council describing the situation as systematic and widespread. And internationally, the country has also grown into a pariah state in the sense that it has suffered pervasive isolation from regional and international forums such as the African Union and the United Nations Security Council. So my argument is that ensuring peace and security in at least in Eritrea to some extent may also contribute significantly to the entire conflicts in the Horn of Africa. As I said before, in many ways, the Eritrean government is involved directly or indirectly in several of the conflicts that are taking place in the Horn of Africa. So while all countries of the region face tremendous challenges and enduring threats to state authority, even state fragility, to an extent that the conflicts seem to be giving rise to the sense of compassion fatigue. I mentioned it in my previous slides. All the prevailing political situation in the Horn of Africa is definitely antithesis to the achievement of the overarching objectives of the three interrelated concepts. So in trying to solve the conflicts and the problems of the region, it's also important to give more focus to those regional elements or regional countries which are playing more disproportionate role than the others in exacerbating the conflicts of the region. So in short, solving some of the problems in Eritrea, the internal and the regional, which have far-reaching regional dimensions, will immensely contribute in improving regional peace security in the Horn of Africa. So with this, I come to the conclusion of my presentation. I assume there will be some questions and comments that may be raised from the audience, and I will be glad to address these questions in the comments and questions session. Thank you very much.